Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole, and I'm an environmental consultant, researcher, and urban agriculturalist. I started my food growing journey when I was 15 years old, volunteering for an organization that some of you may know called Seeds for Change. We started our first community garden behind a fire hall, about 4 blocks from where I lived. And it was the definition of grassroots. But, there's a saying that all it takes to change the world is a group of thoughtful and committed citizens. And that's exactly who we are. Today, I work full time on low carbon and social equity initiatives at scale, but I still teach what I've learned to those who want and need to grow their own food. I really believe that healthy, fresh, organic food is a human right, and that this knowledge should be made as accessible as possible. So that being said, today we'll be learning about what is literally foundational to this work, which is creating healthy, rich, and prosperous soils.
Welcome to our workshop on healthy soils, with a spotlight on lasagna and trench composting.
I like to think that I'm a big picture thinker and a local level actor. I believe it's really important to consider both the larger impacts of our actions on the world and then also consider the bigger picture or the broader context before we take action. So the bigger picture is this. We're facing an immediate environmental emergency involving multiple threats: climate disruption, a global water crisis, vanishing species, food insecurity for nearly 1 billion people. Many of our fresh water supplies, both in Canada and around the world, are in severe decline, both in quantity and quality, and soil degradation is at an all-time high. There are a lot of different pieces to this puzzle, but one that I think flies under our radar most often is our soils. We don't really think about our soils when we think about climate change or species extinction, but protecting and restoring our soils is one of the many keys to alleviating so many of these threats and limiting the climate crisis. Healthy soils, they don't just capture carbon, which is, currently one of our greatest challenges as a species, but healthy soils also increase crop yields, which means there's more food to go around. Healthy soils increase the nutrient value of foods, which boosts human health, and it supports food security globally. So we know all this, we know how important soils are, but our soils and their quality are in severe decline. So much so that the United Nations actually warned that we have only 60 years more of productive farming if the current levels of soil degradation continue. On the plus side, there are some amazing regenerative practices that help to encourage the development and preservation of healthy soils. And while we absolutely need this on a larger scale, we also need to understand it on a smaller scale. And that starts with us. So what are some basic practices for building and restoring our soils? Regardless of if you're growing in a home garden in downtown Toronto, on a balcony, or if you have a 60-acre farm, there are a few things to keep in mind. So first, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides, they damage the biology of the soils. So they have really harmful impacts on our ecosystem. They're also harmful to the people who are working and living in the environment. So when you're, growing your own food, or if you're purchasing it from a grocery store, consider everyone along the supply chain who are working and interacting with an environment that can be very toxic. It helps to choose our food in a way that's organic wherever possible. But also when we're growing our food, using organic fertilizers and natural pest controls rather than harsh chemicals will help to preserve the soil and keep our families and our communities safe and healthy. Our focus today, though, is going to be on several key pieces. So several tips that you can implement yourselves at home to really help preserve and restore our healthy soils. So the first is, as much as possible, to reduce soil disturbances like tillage. So I'm going to teach you one method of preparing the soil, which requires absolutely no tilling. The second is to keep the soil covered and avoid having bare soil. This is a practice that we're going to implement today. And most important for our purposes today, we need to feed the soil. And that requires inputting a mixture of rich, plant-based materials to diversify the biology of the soil. So now we're going to get into it. We're going to start with the composting process. So I'm going to teach you two methods of composting today. Both of them I would consider fairly basic. So if you're starting out, these are great practices to try. Nothing too complex, nothing that requires any sort of financial investment, very little time investment. And I like to consider it the lazy gardener's method because it's very light touch. So once you set it, it's good to go. So the first one that we're going to explore today is lasagna gardening. And this is absolutely the lazy gardener's secret because it's one of those things where you build it and you leave it. So the idea behind lasagna gardening is that you spread a mixture of materials directly into the garden, very, very thinly, so that they break down on their own with little to no help from us. The ecosystem and the microorganisms, they do all the work. It requires no tilling whatsoever. So our lasagna of different layers of materials is built on top of the natural soil. So it requires little to no maintenance. The downside is that it can take a bit longer. So if you want to plant right away in this bed, this might not be the strategy for you. It can also be a little bit of an eyesore. You're going to have, layers of carbon and nitrogen-rich materials, which are amazing for your garden, for your soil, and for the ecosystem. But you might not win the gardener prize of the year. So if you want something that's really aesthetically pleasing, again, this might not be for you. So the philosophy is essentially the same as if you were to compost in a traditional bin or pile. So at the core of it, composting is a pretty scientific process. It involves mixing carbon and nitrogen materials to create a really beautifully rich soil. You may have heard people talk about greens and browns, which ironically doesn't really have much to do with the color at all. When we talk about a green material, we're talking about a material that's very high in nitrogen. And then when we talk about our brown materials, we're talking about materials that are higher in carbon. The plant materials fall in different places along the spectrum. So a carbon material might also have some nitrogen in it, but we're going to look at what it's most densely composed of. But a good way to remember this is by thinking of the way that they feel as opposed to the way that they look. So higher nitrogen or green materials, they tend to be softer, they're more pliable. Brown materials or higher carbon materials tend to feel more stiff, they might feel woody, and we want a good mixture of the two. So the idea is that you have a soil that's not too damp and mushy, but you don't want a soil that's really dry and gritty. Too much carbon, for instance, those stiff and woody materials, your compost is going to be too slow. It's going to take a really long time to decompose. If there's too much nitrogen, so those softer materials, it might get anaerobic, it might get smelly, it might get really hot, very moist, and that's not anything that you want to be planting in. So the combination of the two is really the great balance. So some of our nitrogen sources are manure, grass clippings, garden debris, but with that you want to be mindful to avoid any sort of plants that are diseased. So if they have any sort of infestation of pests, or if they have any sort of mildew or mold, fungus, you want to avoid those. Nitrogen sources can also include coffee grounds. That's a great thing to add to your soil. It's very rich in nutrients for the soil, but it also helps to keep away pests, which is an added bonus. And then vegetable scraps is another common nitrogen source. And then looking at our carbon sources, you can use things like cardboard, newspaper, dry leaves, sawdust, corn stalks even, pine needles, straw. So again, very woody, dry materials. If we were in the garden together, I would show this on a larger scale, but for our digital purposes, I'm going to do a mini lasagna garden in this raised bed here. So the first step to the lasagna garden is that you want to start by clearing the ground, removing any debris like plants, sticks, rocks, anything that would make it uneven. Then you want to start with a carbon source. So you're going to place 3 or 4 layers of newspaper or a thick layer of cardboard, which as you can see is my preference today. You're going to place that over the soil and you're going to dampen the layers with a garden hose. This is just, again, because the carbon sources are very dry, very woody, and you want to help it as much as possible break down faster. Water is a great addition to help with that. You also want to make sure that the newspaper or the cardboard that you use is matte, so it's not shiny, it's not glossy. These inserts oftentimes contain toxic dyes or varnishing chemicals, and you want to be able to keep those out of your soil and ultimately out of your food. So I like to spread 1 inch of compost over the first layer of newspaper or cardboard.
This is because compost is excellent at absorbing and retaining moisture. And that means that I can use less water, both now and in the future. The rich nutrients that are found inside the compost here will ultimately feed the fruits and vegetables that I'll grow in the spring. So we have this first thick inch of nutrient-rich compost. We're going to follow that with 1 inch of those dry carbon materials that we listed before. You could use more cardboard if you'd like. You could use leaves, scrap paper, pine needles. You'll see that I've chosen to use layers of newspaper and scrap paper simply because that's what I had at home. Again, after every carbon layer, it's good practice to wet the paper, leaves, or cardboard with water. The water is going to help your lasagna garden decompose faster, allowing the layers to melt into each other and become that really rich blend of soil that our plants are going to love. Next comes another rich nitrogen layer. I'm using my fruit and vegetable scraps and some of my neighbors as well. Ideally, these layers would be really nice and even and about 1 inch thick, but this ultimately is compost, so it doesn't need to be perfect. We'll keep building the pile, alternating 1 inch of nitrogen-rich materials with 1 inch of carbon materials. Okay, so this is my signature layer and spotlight ingredient, coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are incredibly nitrogen rich, so they make an excellent green layer in spite of their color, but they also serve a double purpose. Coffee grounds are said to repel pests like slugs, ants, and even neighborhood cats. As an added bonus, they also attract earthworms and other organisms that will help our pile decompose quickly. Our pile continues to grow, alternating between 1 inch of carbon and 1 inch of nitrogen-rich materials, watering again after every carbon layer. Then we'll seal our lasagna garden with one final 2-inch layer of carbon. Here you could use more cardboard, more paper, more newspaper, but I prefer the use of straw because I find it almost coats the bed at the end. I'll interject with a quick side note here on the difference between straw and hay, as I found that it comes as a surprise to a lot of people. So straw is dried wheat or grains, whereas hay is dried grass. So the difference is that hay likely contains grass and weed seeds, things that ideally you'd like to keep out of your garden. So ending with a carbon layer like straw or cardboard or newspaper is definitely the way to go. It discourages insects from laying their eggs in the grass clippings or manure, and again, just kind of seals the whole lasagna garden.
So now you're done. The decomposition process begins, and by next spring, your compost will be finished. You'll know when it's done because all of the layers will have melded together, and it will look and feel very much like just a rich soil, a very rich bed. So like all compost, lasagna gardening adds nutrients and microorganisms to the soil. It aerates it and improves its texture. This is a no-tilling method, which, as we know, is a really great way to preserve and restore our soils. It supports the soil health. And yeah, it's a pretty simple, easy way to get your compost and your garden going. So we're going to move on to our second method of compost, which is one of the easiest out there, and it's called trench composting. Trench composting is what I like to call invisible composting. You won't see it, you won't smell it, you'll barely even remember that it's there. Trench composting is a way of composting where you bury the scraps directly into the soil. My family's home is a bit further out of the city, so we see a lot of animals. When we first started composting, we had it in a traditional standing composter, which almost always got broken into by our friendly neighborhood raccoons and rabbits and squirrels and foxes, the whole happy lot. So this method keeps your scraps safe and out of their happy paws. Trench composting is really simple. And if you have enough space, you could realistically just dig an 18-inch hole, dump your scraps in, and move on. But if you want to be organized, which we should always aspire to be, you can divide up your garden into sections with a plan to rotate your trench every 3 to 6 months. Because this is a pretty flexible process, here are a few rules of thumb. So first, you want your hole to be between 12 to 18 inches deep, and at least 6 inches away from the nearest plants. Luckily, there's not very much planted in this garden today, so keeping the 6-inch distance from the nearest plants isn't going to be difficult whatsoever. I'm going a little bit too shallow today. I would recommend going deeper than I am today. Here, my hole is about 12 inches deep. I'm in a pretty shallow bed, unfortunately, so I don't have a lot of room. This would be great to do in an in-ground bed. Then I'm gonna fill in my materials. So here I have those really nitrogen-rich materials. I'm gonna bury this into the bed here, and then we're gonna cover the material with at least 6 to 8 inches of soil.
I'm also adding a layer of straw on top. This will help add a little bit of depth to my trench where I'm finding that the bed is a bit too shallow. It will also help keep the soil protected over the winter. It's always a great practice to keep your soil covered to reduce soil erosion. As we know, healthy soils are full of microorganisms, and like all living beings, they need food and cover to survive. This trench composting method, followed by a healthy layer of straw, guarantees them both things.
So what can you bury in your trench? So here's where we'll go back to our greens and our browns. The trench method is primarily used for green materials that are super nitrogen rich. So you'll want to include your fresh plants like fruits and vegetable scraps. You could also include things like eggshells, tea bags, bean-based products like breads and crackers. You'll want to avoid things like meat, bones, dairy, oily and greasy products, just because it's not it's not going to really add as much to the soil, and it might also attract animals that you know would like to keep away. So let's talk about the benefits of this. So obviously there's some great benefits. You don't really have to touch it. You don't really have to do anything for it over time. It will slowly decompose into the soil. The worms and the microorganisms in the soil will be very happy. One of the downsides, though, is that sometimes people really like to have shovel ready compost, which means you have your compost pile or your bucket and you're able to move it around the garden. And you can add it to pots or raised beds. So, this method isn't great for that because obviously you're burying it right in the ground in the bed. But it does add a lot of richness to the soil in which it's planted.
And you're done. You've successfully explored and hopefully will deploy 2 easy composting methods. I know that this has been a lot of information, so here are a few key takeaways. To start, these 2 methods balance the carbon and the nitrogen naturally found in organic materials, turning our household waste like paper, cardboard, coffee grounds, and food scraps into something of incredible value. Second, remember that developing and sustaining healthy, nutrient-rich soil is the key to developing and sustaining healthy and nutrient-rich food sources. Finally, healthy soils make healthy people and a healthy planet. Our soil is a critical piece in mitigating the climate crisis, meeting the needs of the world's hungry, and ensuring the health of our ecosystems for
It may
generations to
feel
come.
like a very simple practice, but protecting and restoring our soils in this way is critical to mitigating the climate crisis, restoring our ecosystems, and ensuring that we have nutrient rich, fresh, and organic food for our families for generations to come.